almost none. But if my voice is reaching you, there may yet be a possibility open to you.
I am the rebel soul that resides within you.
There's something to be said about video games in their early chapters and levels. A great deal of weight of importance is placed upon the first level to further sell the rest of the game. Meanwhile, immediately trying to communicate how the game is played in the first place. So many games get left unfinished or forgotten, while others succeed with multiple runs and a fan following. Persona 5 Royal is in the latter due to amazing presentation, music, visuals, and storytelling. Then it justifies the question: how does a game's opening represent the game as a whole? Persona 5 Royal is an interesting mix between Animal Crossing and Pokemon at its core, where you, a later named protagonist who decided not to go by his canonical name, Ren, is under probation for assault despite it being in defense of a woman who was being sexually assaulted. Now he is off to Shujin Academy to begin his new life for the next year. He encounters Ryuji and on his way to the first day of school, only to show their initial relations to the first boss, Kamoshida, the abusive gym teacher. On their way to school, Ren and Ryuji are accidentally sent to the cognitive representation of Kamoshida's view of Shujin Academy, or Palace, and meet an imprisoned Morgana while awakening their inner rebel spirit, their persona. Tensions are high, On opens up about her position to Kamoshida, On gets her persona, and the game and plot of this chapter properly begins after hours of tutorial and setup and attempt suicide of On's best friend, Shiho. After exploring the palace, fighting the Shadow King of Town, and escaping the collapsing castle, the ragtag team of misfits celebrate their success after much contemplation of their actions, and seeing Kamoshida grovel in his rather public confession. With these events taking place, the Phantom Thieves are born, and the rest of the game can begin. Persona 5 Royal in the Persona series is well regarded for its plot, presentation, and deeper meanings woven through gameplay and narrative elements. Focusing on the story elements, you can see the intentional form the game is taking on the outset that will solidify and elaborate as you progress. In this chapter, you can see the story of a handful of students and their abuse from an authority figure, Kamoshida, in this chapter being a high school gym teacher with significant influence on his fellow staff and students. He is written to be a very easily identifiable villain, and a villain we can relate having dealt with in a familiar way in our lives. His crimes of physical abuse and sexual harassment paints him as an easy to identify villain, and framing him as a high school level instructor and authority figure allows the player to quickly relate to the protagonist and his fellow classmates under his influence. We all had a bad teacher at one point that we wish we could have done something about. This is the whole reason why Professor Umbridge in the Harry Potter wizarding lore, as an example, is hated so much. Although her evil nature is more obstructive rather than actual villainy, her actions and interactions with the other professors and the students at Hogwarts is something that can be easily related to in our own lives. This is why we hate Professor Umbridge more than, say, the actual antagonist. Similarly, Kamoshida is in a similar position of power in Shujin, as it would seem his opinion and thoughts are significant enough to weigh his fellow staff, so everything is ultimately his decision. So now we have a clear evil to overcome early on in the chapter. Ryuji and On's story arc is interesting when seeing this chapter as the origin story it sets out to be. It is interesting to point out that going into Kamoshida's palace was a last resort effort in the eyes of Ryuji and Ren. There's a bit where you and Ryuji attempt to gather information regarding the alleged abuse the volleyball team was receiving, but each student seems to keep repeating the same excuses and deflecting your advances towards the truth. With no other option, Morgana simply offers the idea to simply steal his distorted desires lying within the palace, causing a change of heart or a shift in his cognitive functions. This would alter the mental processes and rationality he takes towards his misdeeds and, with some convincing of the shadow self of the target, confesses his crimes and seeks restitution. On later joins in after seeing Shiho enter a coma after a failed suicide attempt caused by Kamoshida's actions towards her. In contrast, Ryuji's motivations is based on actions from the past, with Kamoshida breaking his leg after Ryuji haphazardly tried to punch Kamoshida after he made fun of his absent father. It was seen as self-defense by the school in favor of Kamoshida, while ruining Ryuji's track career early on, since the injury prevented him from returning to compete. This was an action that had already occurred prior to the events of the plot that would be his motivations to do anything. It is only when he meets Ren and has their accidental trip into the palace where he feels the need to act, when the allegations he already knew to be true was far worse than he imagined. This creates an interesting narrative and exposition for these characters, as their stories and motivations are heavily tied back to Kamoshida's actions and their emotional response to these actions, both present and past. As far as the narrative of the first chapter is concerned, everything is focused on the immediate goal while establishing plot elements and a potential flow to each chapter. This is where things get interesting, as the game has two gameplay loops that mesh together to make the Persona experience we understand to be. There are two halves to Persona: a life simulator with its own RPG stats and checks, and a turn-based combat dungeon crawler, like Pokemon by comparison. This allows for an interesting dichotomy of action and relaxing gameplay, allowing the player to cycle between each section, experiencing one and recharging from the other. Before we continue, there are two specific things we need to be addressing to add context to both sections of the game: the Velvet Room and due dates. The due dates are to prevent the player from collecting all the benefits from either half of the game, where you collect too many perks from the life simulator and getting too high of a social stat, or getting too high a level in the dungeon crawling section. Conversely, the Velvet Room enables the player to access the best parts of both. Personas can be purchased, fused, and converted into items or equipment. The Persona's Arcana assists and mechanics relating to the real world and pushing the pace of relationships with other characters to get their benefits, and in return will allow for even greater fusions of Personas. These elements help generate a significant flow between each section, as mechanics one half benefit the other. This also regulates the flow as to prevent overpowering the player and make time management a game mechanic in and of itself. The life simulator isn't explored early on, as not much is available to the player outside of the school and cafe respectively. The player can pass time by improving their relationship with key individuals to obtain perks and improve fusion results for the player's Pokédex, or properly known as the Persona Compendium. However, some character interactions will be locked if the player doesn't pass the correct social skills check. This applies to some events within the game, like some dialogue options, minor events throughout the day. Although this seems secondary at first, this is your chance to gain perks to improve your chances in palaces, get new equipment, access the Velvet Room's functions, and experience the side stories of the characters you interact with. The lack of options available could reflect how new the protagonist is to the area, while using his knowledge of the area to pace out progression within potential activities he'll have access to later. Meanwhile, dungeon crawling is in a similar position. You are only allowed to explore Kamoshida's palace. Mementos is yet to be explored due to the plot's pressure on the current situation, and will be available later on. But more on that in a moment. This is where you can grind out levels to improve your stats to fuse into better personas in the Velvet Room, obtain new personas in the wild, level up current personas, look for palace-specific treasures like weapons and accessories, or attempt to progress the story before the time limit ends and force a game over and force you to restart the week before the end of the allowed time. On a first run, the limitations are used wisely, as it makes the player focus in on on specific elements that will be core to the gameplay of Persona 5 Royal. Nothing is unnecessary, and nothing is out of the primary rules of the game. The limitations become more obvious in subsequent runs, as you're more likely to have your social stats maxed out, and the side activities that assist in other stats aren't available yet, nor is exploring mementos or grinding out levels and searching for items and personas to assist you. For what it is, it's a great way for newcomers to get into the game, but may be tedious for those looking for things worthwhile to do that may not be already tied to a trophy or specific achievements that they're looking for. The opening section of actual gameplay to Persona 5 is well done and executed, on the condition that this is the very first time the player is enjoying the game. It is hyper-focused on the core elements of the gameplay loops established. This is a double-edged sword, as returning players for a New Game Plus can run out of things to do really quickly, with no way to significantly pass time without feeling the need to go achievement hunting as an excuse to pass time in the game, or do something that they already have that will result in no net benefit. The writing is well executed, allowing the player to clearly understand what is to be done, how to do it, while feeling the exact weight of the situation. This is one of gaming's best examples of a level 1 experience.